Hello and welcome to Hot and Heavy, the Elaine podcast. I'm your host, Shivani Desai. Today I'll be talking about Season 3, Episode 1, The Note. Hello everyone! Yay! We're in Season 3! Wow! We made it through what I think might be the most, I guess I would describe it as the most trepidatious seasons of Seinfeld. Maybe that's still not right. Not that we're totally out of it, but we're getting to the real familiar parts of Seinfeld that I think, helped the show get as popular as it was. There were hints of it here and there, but once we get more into Season 3, we definitely get into more classic Seinfeld feeling and tone and pacing. So I'm really excited to start Season 3. I hope you are. Hope everyone's doing well. Also, I'm doing pretty well. I'm performing tonight in an improv show. I'm really excited. Over the pandemic, I did a lot actually of virtual shows, which I just didn't know what that would be like, or would that be worth my time, or would it even work? Would anyone even log in? And sometimes people didn't, but it really was so much more fun than I thought it was going to be. I got to reconnect with some of my Detroit folks and the theater I used to perform with there, and it was just so much fun and really helped me through the stress of the pandemic. But now, there are some opportunities to do some in-person improv. I did one show since the pandemic a couple months ago. A friend of mine, a very dear friend of mine, was moving, and so there was kind of this farewell show, so we all got together and did a show with her, and that felt awesome. I wasn't sure how it would be, is it like riding a bike, doing improv? And no, it's not. It can take a bit to get back into it. But luckily, if you're performing with really strong people who just lift you up, it's not as painful or as difficult as you would think. And so tonight, I'm really excited to be performing with some awesome people. Definitely feels odd in the sense of I have to drive to a theater, something I used to do really often, like once or twice a week. And now it feels really daunting. I'm like, oh gosh, now I have to think about traffic, and this is just the odd effects of being in a quarantine, I guess. I will say I did love how I could just log onto a Zoom or whatever platform they were using for a virtual show. It was really easy. Just go to my basement, lock myself up in this closet, which I'm doing my podcast from. So the idea of having to commute to a show, and just the nature of where I've lived, every improv theater has been at least 45 minutes away from where I live. So it's always a little bit of a trek, but totally worth it. Very excited. How many times can I say it? I am very excited to perform tonight. All right, so let's get into this episode. I said that very excitedly, but this wasn't a very exciting episode for Elaine, and any of you familiar with The Note would already know that. But the synopsis from my coffee table book is as follows. Jerry, George, and Elaine get a dentist friend investigated for insurance fraud after using his notes to get massages covered by their insurance. George worries that his massage from a man may have turned him on. Meanwhile, Jerry small talks his way into being mistaken for a child abductor, and Kramer spots Joe DiMaggio at a donut shop. This episode was written by Larry David. So we start out the episode, Jerry's getting a massage. There's no Elaine, but I'll go over this real quick because it does help. It's sort of the first setup scene. Jerry's making chit-chat with his masseuse, Juliana. Through the chit-chat, he brings up this kid who got abducted in Pennsylvania and how awful it was. And right away, Juliana just gets really panicky and overly protective about the kid and where he is and who watches him during the day. And she doesn't live around here. Overreacts, in my opinion. Chill out, Juliana. Jeez. Juliana is played by Terry Hanauer. She's appeared in many television shows from the 80s through the early 2000s, and then she transitioned into directing. She doesn't have any acting credits past like 2001, but she has a lot of directing and producing credits, and she's been directing a lot of short films for the past 20 years. So that's pretty cool. Good for her. She's fine in this scene. I'm just not a fan of the way this is directed. I mean, she goes from like 0 to 60 in terms of becoming panicked. And I know it's for the purpose of the story, but for me, it was a little too far-fetched to be realistic. I guess there wasn't enough creepiness in what Jerry said or any foundation to her being a panicked person or just maybe high-strung. So for me, it just doesn't work. I mean, perhaps if Larry David had included a little bit more of her being paranoid, just like a paranoid person in general, with a little chit chat up top, or like I said, maybe Jerry's dialogue could have been more like mildly threatening. Like he makes it like, I guess, perfect for Jerry being a comedian. He could have made some kind of joke, but she took it seriously. Maybe she doesn't have a sense of humor. I don't know. But this whole really huge leap for her to get so panicked and scared of Jerry within the matter of like 7 seconds seemed, it just didn't work and almost seemed a little lazy to me as far as the writing went. So we move on to the second scene, Jerry's apartment. Jerry's telling the story of what happened with Juliana, the masseuse, and how she started kind of freaking out. And Elaine was just annoyed with Jerry. She says, well, that was stupid, really stupid. I can't believe you said that. She doesn't want to hear that. Just rubbing it in Jerry's face. Jerry mentions that he doesn't want to stop going to her because she's also a physical therapist, which can be covered by insurance if you get a doctor's note. It's really a medical procedure. That makes George's ears perk up. A massage can be covered by insurance? While he's rummaging through Jerry's fridge to look for something to eat. Always hungry, George. The purpose of this scene, it's a second scene, but sort of a continuation of our setup scene. And Jerry feels bad about upsetting Juliana. And George is into this note idea from a doctor to get a massage covered by insurance. Overall, it's pretty boring. Not a lot of comedy in this scene. I like Elaine giving it to Jerry with the whole "that was stupid" thing, but yeah, overall it's not great. The exposition to set up everything was a bit clunky in my opinion. I think George's ginger rant, what's ginger? Why is everything got ginger? I felt like that was supposed to be the comedy breaks in the scene because there wasn't much else, and they were fine, but just not effective enough for me. Moving on to the next scene, we're at the physical therapist's office with George and Elaine filling out their forms. George finds out that he's going to be with Raymond, a male masseur. I guess that's redundant. A masseur or physical therapist, I guess. I'm not sure if they all are physical therapists in this office. Doesn't really matter, but just something I had in my notes. Elaine doesn't want to switch with George because, it could get sexual. Exactly. Then we get some good Elaine and George back and forth. I wouldn't feel comfortable. What if it felt good? It's supposed to feel good. Exactly. I like the back and forth between George and Elaine. It's always very pleasurable comedically. Raymond then enters. A strapping blonde masseur comes out with a big smile to escort George to the room. I have to say, the camera angle where George is looking up at Raymond, I mean, it's just his ass in the foreground. And I don't know why. That's just comedy to me. Whatever. I just love that. And so, yeah, Raymond says, George, come on back. And Elaine's just loving all of this. She's just smiling big as she watches George so uncomfortably being escorted back to the massage room. Purpose of the scene, we see the George story move forward with his intense homophobia about getting a massage from a man. So my overall take on this scene, I'll just get into it now. It's hard to watch this scene in current times. I mean, look, as I've said before, I do try and take into consideration the time and the tone in which this episode was made. And and I've made this clear before in other episodes, I have, zero tolerance for homophobia. I do have a take on this particular scene, this particular episode, in fact. All of George's homophobia is portrayed very clearly as his own intense insecurity that we can tell from Jason Alexander's performance. It's his biggest battle. I mean, his insecurity, it's about so many things. And I don't, at least me personally, I never get the sense from George that he feels he's proud of being homophobic. He doesn't defend it. He just, all he knows is that's how he feels, and he's terrified of being seen as anything less than, different from the heteronormative reality he's been conditioned to strive for. That was a mouthful, but I want to be careful about sounding like I'm defending this homophobia in the episode. I'm not defending it. I'm really just trying to absorb it and take it for what it is. It doesn't come off as hateful homophobia to me, which if it was like that, I don't think I would be a fan of Seinfeld. My interpretation of George in this scene, and really the whole episode, maybe I guess his homophobia within the whole series, is he's a man who grew up in a time where homosexuality was seen as something to be afraid of, and as we see later, it's not that he wants to punish gays. It's not a hateful thing. Like I said, he's not against it as an orientation, the whole, not that there's anything wrong with that we'll see later. But I see this as a conditioned response, to the way society treated homosexuality, and not an outwardly like aggressive or violent, hate of gay people. That's the way I interpret it. I completely understand I am not coming at this from a person in that community from that perspective. So I would love to hear what people think watching this scene, both as Seinfeld fans and people who maybe aren't familiar with Seinfeld and then watch the scene. I mean, let's face it, there are so many cringy things from not that long ago. I mean, we've really only made a lot of progress, I want to say, within the last 5 or 6 years, to be very mindful of the language, the portrayal of everyone in the LGBTQ plus community. So that being said, everything I said, which I hope I don't sound like I'm totally defending it, because I do think it is super cringy to watch. But that being said, the scene and the episode with George's homophobia, it's cringeworthy, and there's no getting around that. And 30 years later, I can see how far we've come, and that's what I choose to focus on. Beyond being so dated with his attitude, I'm looking at this episode through the lens of discovering just how insecure George is and the neuroses he deals with on a daily basis about everything. This is just shaping more of the George character. And part of his character at this point, as cringy as it is to see now, was homophobia that does crop up from time to time on this series. So we move on to George's massage scene, and I won't cover this too deeply. There's no Elaine in this scene, obviously, but it's just the classic scene where George is so goddamn uncomfortable and awkward. The actor who plays Raymond, whose name is Jeff Lester, he does a great job. The guy just plays it so straight and so straightforward, not meaning straight as in an orientation. I just meant straight man in comedy. Just plays it perfectly. I love how it's so grounded. I think anyone who has a client on their table whose job it is to make them feel comfortable, if someone's acting the way George is acting in this scene, I mean, they'd definitely be a little like, what is happening here? Exactly the way Jeff Lester plays it. It's very good. It's very, he's doing a great job. He's really trying to help George, but just George can't get beyond this absolute crippling and like almost paralyzing fear of what might happen with a man massaging him. And then after that scene, we have a super quick scene in the lobby, and George is just walking out shell-shocked about his possible boner. Elaine is sitting like jelly in the lobby asking how it went. The purpose of this scene, we see George very troubled after his massage. And my overall take, there's not much to say. I mean, the scene is like 4 seconds, but I just wanted to mention real quick, I love the really quick look at some physicality by Julia Louis-Dreyfus here. She just had a massage, so she's so tranquil and sort of hunched over from her muscles being so relaxed. As an actor, these are the little moments I internalize. Like, no matter how short the scene, your character has purpose, your character has been somewhere, so just act your ass off, even if you're on camera for like 2 seconds. It was great. Just my little nerdy actor mind working overtime. The next couple of scenes don't have Elaine, but I will cover them really quick. We're in Jerry's apartment. Jerry can't get an appointment. George enters, and we get the classic "I think it moved" scene. And this was so classic, in fact, that they used this as the audition piece for the Jerry pilot. The whole conversation happens with, "That's the test, contact," you know. They sound like a couple 13-year-old boys, which I think is kind of the point. That's something else. I think that this episode, there's definite homophobia, but I also feel like they're making themselves the punchline here about how ridiculous they not only view it, but have this conversation about a gay test. I mean, these grown men are talking about this as if it's reality. And I'll just skip past the whole "that's what a gym teacher told me" thing. It just seems very disturbing on many levels. But Kramer enters. He saw Joe DiMaggio at Dinky Donuts. George pressures Jerry to get a note from Roy, even though he never said he'd do that. But George isn't working at $75. He can't afford that. Moving on, now we're in Roy's office. Jerry's uncomfortable asking, but Roy says, it's not a big deal. He does these things all the time. George is incredibly distracted by the Evander Holyfield poster and gets super defensive when Roy asks if he likes him. In the next scene, we're back in Jerry's apartment. He's back on the phone. As he's talking on the phone, he smushes next to Elaine on the couch, hangs up, and gives her a hard time about it. But Elaine says, "I was here. I was already sitting here. You smushed me." Very middle school conversation, much like the gay test conversation. So I guess there's some consistency there. Kramer saw Joe DiMaggio again. Elaine is really interested and excited about it, but Jerry says no way. He's not a dunker. There's just no way. After Kramer demonstrates how he was banging on the table and whooping it up to get his attention, and he was very focused, that's how he played baseball. I love how Elaine says, "Why didn't you just call out his name?" to Kramer responding with a blank stare. George enters with ripped pants and a bloody knee. These kids called him a Mary because of the way he leapt over a puddle. And there's just more Elaine George, kind of a brother-sister ribbing here. I love how Elaine's does the impression of his leap. "What was this? No, really, I want to know, what's this?" Roy calls. Oh man, he's under investigation for insurance fraud. Oh. And Jerry says, "I knew we shouldn't have gotten 3 notes." And Elaine's like, "Wait a second, you got one for me? I got one for my gynecologist. We never said anything." And Jerry says, "Well, that's why he's being investigated. 4 notes from 2 different doctors." So the purpose of this scene, we're seeing the consequences of the note request. And my overall take, the best part of the scene was Kramer, again, demonstrating what he did at Dinky Donuts to try and get Joe DiMaggio's attention. There is one small moment that's off to the side, and you guys have to understand at this point, a lot of times, even if she's not the focus, I'm always watching what JLD is doing. And there's a small moment while Jerry's on the phone with Roy. George is coming out from, I think, the bathroom, getting a towel for his bloody knee. And there's this moment where Elaine looks at him and she kind of puts her hand out almost to say, "Here, give it to me. I'll help you." And George kind of says no. And it's like this kind of sweet moment. And that is the essence of their relationship, where she teases George a lot. They give each other a hard time like brother and sister, but she still cares about him and has his back. So that tiny moment off to the side, I really enjoyed that. And I love when actors make these choices where they know they're on camera, so they're obviously still acting and in character. But something like that, like a little thing like that, really, I think, adds to a relationship. And not everyone's going to notice it, but they do it because that's what feels right as their characters. So that was just something that I noticed and really appreciated. All right, so now we're back to Roy's office. No Elaine in this scene, but Pam, the receptionist, is pissed and keeps yelling at Jerry and George as they talk to Roy with a patient in between them who's knocked out on gas, I guess. They're apologizing profusely. Roy's kind of not saying much, and then he says, "You know what? It's not a big deal, guys. We're totally fine as long as a physical therapist goes along with their story." Oops. Yikes. Might be an issue. Back at the physical therapist's office, Jerry's trying to apologize to Juliana, who, as soon as she sees Jerry and her son's with her, oh no, she shields him and tells him to run away and go in the office and lock the door, call the police. Oh my goodness, she's terrified of Jerry. Again, totally not earned, in my opinion. All right, so then we are on to our last scene in Monks. Elaine says, "Oh, he just got 6 months probation. It's a slap on the wrist." George is still struggling. Men are starting to enter his sexual fantasies, and he tells him to get out of here. Kramer arrives. He just threw up from the gas. They're all very grossed out. Can relate. I would be grossed out as well. And then they all see Joe DiMaggio eating a donut in Monks off camera. A nice little button. Kramer slams on the table super loud and starts yelping. Obviously, this is our resolution scene. And overall, it's nothing exciting. Not really a lot of comedy. All right, let's take a quick break, and I will see you on the other side. Ba 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 do 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 dee da la da 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 da. Oh yeah. Hello, I'm Sandra Lavagine, founding member of the legendary jazz duo, the Scatterbrains. Za 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 za. I've been scatting my way through the music industry for over 40 years. My work has been featured on all 38 volumes of Now Scat's What I Call Music. And now I've compiled all my classic scats into a new solo album, She's All Scat. You'll be sure to recognize them all. From the 1980 pantyhose ad, va-voom, va-va-va-voom, to the background music featured on a 1982 episode of It's a Living. Believe me, I thought it would be impossible to follow up the success of my first album, Scat Outta Hell. But I have no doubt this album will satisfy your scatting needs. To purchase my new album, just check the box for She's All Scat on your Columbia House CD Club tearaway card found in some issues of Archie Comic Double Digest. It's that easy. Allow me to scat all your troubles away with my new album, She's All Scat. Because a world without scatting is just too quiet. Zoo, 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 shwee-da-doo-da-dee, hey! And we're back. Some of the extras, not a ton to go over, but there was a deleted scene, and it explains why Pam, the receptionist at Roy's office, is so pissed. Pam is actually Roy's wife, so it makes more sense. That's why she's so mad. Moving on to Contributor Corner, Greg has some great thoughts this week. Well, I'm assuming they're great. Like I said before, I do not read these until right now. So Greg says, Elaine doesn't get much to do in this episode, as it is very much George's story of the homophobia he faces before, during, and after receiving a massage from a man. It's very funny how he goes to his appointment with Elaine, and because she wants a woman massaging her so it doesn't get sexual, George wants the opposite because, for him, it probably would feel sexual either way. I love when George and Elaine go somewhere without Jerry, because without Jerry there to humor George's neuroses, Elaine doesn't even stand for it. She shuts him down, leaving him with no resolution or justification for his feelings. I like when George walks out, numb to the world, after the massage, while Elaine is all happy and relaxed, and how she has to call out for him as he walks away without a word. Yeah, this is a lot of what, kind of what I mentioned, Greg. I definitely agree with all of what you said. Yeah, George and Elaine sans Jerry is great. And I know we're going to get an episode soon where they're kind of forced to hang out without Jerry because Jerry's watching a dog and all this stuff. We'll get to that. And they make it seem like it never happens and it's really awkward. So these moments are really great because, yeah, Elaine's not going to put up with this bullshit. Like, no, I'm not going to switch with you. I don't care how uncomfortable you are. That's not my issue. Greg goes on to say, I love the moment between Jerry and Elaine when he goes to sit on the end of the couch and has to nudge her to slide over. I was here first is such a childish thing to say. This childishness carries over into the conversation with Kramer about whether Joe DiMaggio dunks a donut. Elaine laughs super hard as Kramer tells the story. Everyone gets starstruck, so I like when the characters on this show do with real-life celebrities, whether they are there to play themselves or not. Elaine continues her giddiness when mocking how George said he jumped over the puddle. George, what is this? This entire scene from start to finish is basically showing how adults really do act like kids. Yes, exactly. I did, like I said earlier, I loved the whole "you nudged me." Like it's so infantile and so funny at the same time. And I think that is part of the charm of all these characters. They're adults technically, but they all have tendencies to act like they are at most 13 years old. And finally, Greg says, my favorite thing in this whole episode is when Jerry and George are talking to the dentist while a patient is unconscious between them. And I love the choice to have her wake up while they're still standing there. It's so inappropriate, which makes it all the funnier. All in all, a very funny George episode with not much for Elaine to do but tag along. Yes. And it was funny, in the notes about nothing, they did mention that patient, that actress, was supposed to be awake and sort of interacting with them. But then during rehearsals, they made the decision for her to just be unconscious the whole time, which I do think is a lot funnier. We have another contributor this week, Lee. Lee has contributed before, and this week he sent in some thoughts. Lee says, not only has George's homophobia not aged well, but I found the jokes lazy and cheap, which is atypical for Seinfeld. The premise was the 1990s equivalent of Milton, Mr. Television Burl, appearing in drag. That's really interesting, Lee. Yeah, and I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into that during my final thoughts about this episode. But yes, I agree. I already kind of addressed it already, but it's cringy, and it certainly hasn't aged well. I don't think any homophobic content ages well, and I'm glad we're in a time where we can recognize that and certainly learn from it. Lee goes on to say, the other issue I had with the episode was the closing shot of Joe DiMaggio dunking a donut in his coffee at Monk's. This seemed an indulgent and uncharacteristic feel-good moment. Of all the shows in the series, the note should not have had a happy ending. Yeah, that's why I really didn't have a lot to say about it. There's really no comedy in it. It was just kind of cheesy. It almost felt like there should have been something, like a pie in the face moment at the end. But yeah, it didn't really work either for me. Yeah, a weird feel-good moment. That's a really good way to put it. Next, Lee mentions, my favorite JLD moment was also in this last scene when George is recounting how men are entering into his fantasies when I'm in the middle. Elaine says, of what? And he gestures. Her look of recognition and then mild disgust was perfect. Oh, wow. Yeah, that was a good moment. I kind of missed that. To me, it does seem a little uncharacteristic. Like, come on, Elaine is a sexually awakened human being. Perhaps that comes later. Maybe she's not as sexually awakened as we are maybe used to her in later seasons. But JLD is never disappointing when it comes to expressions and wordless acting. So, yeah, I can definitely see why that's your favorite moment, Lee. And lastly, Lee says, perhaps I'm being too harsh on the episode and I should view it as foundational for the future. Not that there's anything wrong with that, and master of my domain classics. Yeah, Lee, it's funny. As I'm going through these earlier episodes, it's easy to be a little bit harsh on them. Again, for two things. I mean, you know how good it gets later, but also when there are these moments of cringy, homophobic comedy, just knowing what we know now and being at this point right now in 2021 where we've made so much progress, it's almost hard to believe, even though we know we've seen these episodes, we know that we, God forbid, even enjoyed some of these jokes. It's hard to believe that people could get away with it. One of my favorite shows of all time is Three's Company. I mean, John Ritter is definitely my earliest comedic influence. I loved everything about him. And I think I was too young to even absorb what I was liking about him. But I could do a whole other podcast of why I love John Ritter so much. But, that show, my goodness, talk about cringy, about but that's in the late 70s, early 80s. So you have to consider that. And I do remember John Ritter responding in an interview about, this was like a groundbreaking show for the gay community and all this stuff. And John Ritter was and this had to have been, obviously, he passed away, almost 20 years ago, I think. He was saying this, not even, as, I guess, quote unquote, woke as we are now, but he was like, I really don't see my character doing a lot of good for the gay community. I mean, if anything, we might have taken him back and fed some stereotypes. So he was just such a great person and such a thoughtful, and conscious actor saying, look, I mean, it was a great role and I cherished that time, but I can't sit here and say I'm proud of what we did in my portrayal as a guy pretending to be gay. You know, it was very stereotypical and stuff like that. So I really appreciated the fact that he recognized that. So, and that's all we can do when we make content. I mean, look, I feel like there's going to be content made today that 20 years down the road, we're going to be like, oh my God, that was not appropriate, or that was just not what we should have done. And so as long as we're always improving and learning and taking things to the next level, I think that's what really matters, especially in comedy. Comedy is, it's a tricky thing when you want to make jokes about things, but then you have to really look back and say, am I punching down to a certain community? Is this really the most elevated comedy I can do? I'm totally getting into my final thoughts, so I'm going to move on. Thank you, Lee, so much for your thoughts. I really appreciate everything you said, and I agree wholeheartedly. If you would like to become a contributor on this show, please email me at elainepodcast@gmail.com. That's elainepodcast@gmail.com. All right, my favorite Elaine moment. There's not much to choose from, but if I were going to pick one, I would have to pick ribbing Jerry that was stupid, really stupid. I just love when she just does not give him a break and calls him out on certain things, because she's kind of the only one who can call him out. And the back and forth is what also makes it great. Like, hey, I already said it was stupid. I'm agreeing with you. Like, why do you have to keep rubbing it in? And it's just Elaine. It's the Elaine we love. She has to keep rubbing it in. So my final notes, no Elaine storyline. God damn it. Just when you think they've learned from keeping JLD in the wings with all her comedic talent, everything she showed in season 2, they open season 3 with nothing for Elaine. I mean, seriously, come on, Larry. This is yet another George-centric episode. That sounds like I'm upset about it. Look, Jason Alexander is a master, so I understand why he gets these very meaty storylines. Plus, he's basically playing Larry David, so a lot more to go on. I guess I've dipped my toe into it multiple times in this episode, but just a bit more about the cringiness of this homophobic comedy. To me, forgive me if this is redundant again, but, I don't think it can be said enough. I feel it's important to see the evolution of the portrayal of homosexuality through the years. I mean, especially within the last 30 years. I mean, 30 years ago was when this episode aired. And considering that's when it was actually on the forefront of a lot of entertainment, I mean, homophobia was getting called out more. I mean, in the 90s, there was an explosion of awareness. More artists were coming out as gay. Things were really changing rapidly. I've actually been watching Friends with my daughter. She's obsessed with it. In rewatching that series, there are tons more uncomfortable jokes about being gay. I mean, it's just a running joke that Chandler might be gay all the time. And then, there's this whole kind of a transphobic thing with Chandler's dad and all this. So there's, way more than Seinfeld, but a lot of homophobic, uncomfortable jokes about being gay and homosexuality in general. And one thing I did know about the show, one of the creators, David Crane, he's a gay man. And I was doing a little bit of research, diving into maybe interviews, because this is such a hot topic of late, especially with all these reboots happening of old shows. People are like, well, are you going to address the, whatever it is, homophobia, the lack of diversity, which is a huge one, all these types of issues that now we're so aware of, but, getting the take on those issues with the show creators or the stars or whatever. So, what I can say, and there wasn't a ton. I feel like he's kind of kept mum about it, but there were a couple of comments or quotes I found from David Crane. He says, "Friends may not have always gotten it right, but it was a good faith attempt. And besides, most of it is really funny and has nothing to do with homophobia." I don't know if I agree with that. This was from another article. Crane, who is gay, strongly rejects the implication that Chandler was homophobic. Quote, "He has his own anxieties and issues, but I don't think the character was homophobic in the least," end quote. I feel like we get into this complicated territory of a gay man of an older generation trying to justify homophobia or homosexuality being played for laughs. It's something that I know many of my gay friends, they've sort of been the victims of that portrayal of those early, those shows of that era. And so I'm certainly not going to vilify David Crane for his opinion, but at the same time, it's kind of like, well, I think there's a big portion of what maybe he's not addressing or he's missing. And maybe I couldn't find anything for him, out there on the internet where he really addresses this in a real way. But he definitely sounds a little bit like this wasn't homophobia. This was just comedy. It's complicated to say that. I mean, Friends was the biggest show for almost 10 years. So what you put out there has a heavy influence. If you're playing, if there's a scene where they make fun of Joey for carrying what they call a man purse and saying, oh, you need your lipstick. And it's very, it's very heteronormative. And that's just how it was at the time. But I think the least you can do as a creator of that content is be like, well, we definitely didn't understand the consequences of what we were putting out there. And Marta Crane, who is one of the other creators of Friends, she's definitely been more vocal about, saying like, yeah, I look back and definitely don't think we did any favors for the gay community. And so she's had a little different take on it. And ultimately, the shows from this era can almost be seen as period pieces, for lack of a better term. I mean, an education of what used to be seen as comedic. And like I've said a few times now, we can learn from that and elevate comedy to be based on things that don't punch down to entire communities or sexual orientation, gender, race, socioeconomic classes, whatever it may be. Any marginalized group of people shouldn't be the butt of a joke, in my opinion. And for decades, I mean, entertainment has had this luxury of no consequences for their contribution to perpetuating stereotypes. But as we've seen in the past few years, that's just because they went for the lazy, the tired jokes, and ultimately not really funny jokes. I mean, I'm not going to get into this whole like cancel culture is the worst or whatever. It's just, I don't believe in like canceling all of it, but I do believe in seeing things that were or that are lauded, forms of entertainment, like a Seinfeld, like a Friends. I mean, they're still considered to be, some of the top TV shows ever in history, but like also taking those and understanding and discussing and taking the good and leaving, behind the troubling aspects of it and understanding, most of all, understanding where the tone and the time of like the creation of what they were doing. And, that's what I'm just trying to be really conscious of. And I honestly do that. I mean, at a much smaller scale, obviously, but I always challenge myself. And I'm learning all the time. I can take so much brilliant technique from this show, from Seinfeld's comedy, but also I can figure out where they could have elevated the tired tropes, right? And apply that to my work. So it's all really just a learning experience. And I'm subconsciously studying it all the time because I don't want to recreate Seinfeld if I'm writing a show. I want to take those sort of core elements of what I love about Seinfeld and elevate it, or I guess evolve it to fit my sensibilities. But, there are things that we learn and we need to leave behind. And I definitely think, an entire show about one character's homophobia is probably one of those things. Whew, okay, we got a little deep. But there, unfortunately, was not a lot of Elaine to discuss in this episode. But I always like these conversations, and I love the thoughts that these types of things spark. And I love talking about comedy. That's just that's my nerd part of me, and I'm not going to apologize for it. I think that's all I can say about The Note. Thank you so much for listening. I'm so excited to keep diving into season 3. I'll see you next time.